Welcome. I'm Professor Akinyele Omoja of the Department of African American Studies at Georgia State University. And I'd like to welcome you this evening for the first in Race and Social Justice book series sponsored by the Center for the Study of Africa and the Diaspora, as well as this Georgia State University Library in partnership with the Decatur Decatur Book Festival, Tonight, we're going to be hearing from this fantastic new book by Professor Natsu Saito, Settler Colonialism, Race and the Law, Why Structural Racism Persists. And I will introduce Professor Saito in a second. Right now, we're going to, at the request of the author, give a salute to those who came before us, what we call libation. First, we salute the Creator in heaven and all of our ancestors who sit at the feet of the Creator. We salute the ancestors and the deities of all the indigenous people of this ground we stand on today. We salute all of our ancestors who were fortunate enough to be buried in the soil of Africa. We salute all the ancestors who died during the Middle Passage. And we salute all of our ancestors who died during the Trail of Tears. We salute all of our ancestors whose names we did not know. We ask them to join us on this day of deliberation, and I'll say in the Yoruba language, Ashe, which means so be it. And now I want to introduce the author whose work we're highlighting tonight, Professor Natsu Taylor Saito. And we'll say Dr. Saito is not only a colleague, but one of my best friends on this campus. Wonderful person, wonderful scholar, activist. Dr. Saito joined the College of Law here at Georgia State University in 1994. She teaches public international law, international human rights seminars in race and the law, federal Indian law, and indigenous rights and professional responsibility. Professor Saito is an author. She's the author of 3 books. The first book she authored was From Chinese Exclusion to Guantanamo Bay, Plenary Power and the Prerogative State. She also authored Meeting the Enemy, American Exceptionalism and International Law. But the focus of our talk this evening is the book, again, Settler Colonialism, Race and the Law. A very important topic for what's going on in the United States today, I would say. So Professor Saito, it's good to see you, and I love that library. Can't wait for the pandemic to end for me to look through you and your husband's library again. But I want to ask you, what brought you to write this book? I know all books for authors are works of passion, and it's something that motivates us to spend that amount of energy and time committing to doing the research and also committing to write the book. So what motivated you to write this book?
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you for that very generous introduction. Before we get started, I too wanted to say that I really appreciate the organizers of the Decatur Book Festival, the GSU institutions, including the Center for Studies of Africa and its Diaspora, for sponsoring this, Elizabeth West and Jeff Steele especially, and Dr. Umoja for hosting this. Thank you so much. And I really appreciate your reminding us of the importance of where we are and acknowledging our ancestors. And even when we have discussions in cyberspace, I feel like it's really important to remember who we are and where we are and how we got here. And in that spirit, I'd like to start by acknowledging that we are, in fact, on the lands of the Muskogee Creek peoples. And since this is the Decatur Book Festival, I just wanted to put in a little plug to recognize that there's an important initiative in Decatur right now that I think you're going to reference later, Dr. Moja, but it concerns the cannon monument that was erected by the Daughters of the Confederacy to commemorate efforts to drive the Creeks from Georgia. So it's it's a very timely initiative. So you asked me why I wrote this book, and there are many motivations probably, but at the time when I started it about 10 years ago, I was really depressed by the fact that we seem to be encountering the same issues over and over again for the past, certainly ever since I came to consciousness. So, more than 50 years. And I felt that in order to really address racism, it was necessary to understand its motivations, its causes, not just what's happening, but why it's happening. And I also remembered from the days of our youth, which was a long time ago, right? The energy and the hope that we had, and how we felt like we were part of a struggle that was changing the world for the better. And it made me sad for young people today to only be seeing sort of the same efforts over and over again with that kind of hope and energy. And so I really wanted to think about what gave us that energy and that motivation, and where was that today for the current generations.
So, Dr. Saito, your title, Settler Colonialism, Race, and the Law. What is colonialism, first of all? I know many of my students, when I ask them that question, they don't have any idea what colonialism is. What is that?
So there are a lot of different definitions of colonialism, of course, but they almost all have in common the notion that there is the exploitation of land and labor and natural resources by people or entities that are not indigenous to that territory where the exploitation is taking place, and the imposition by those who are exploiting of economic, political, and social institutions in order to facilitate the exploitation and the generation of profit from the enterprise. The European colonization that we've had for the past several centuries has generally been exercised by states over entities that weren't recognized as sovereign, weren't recognized by the European colonizers as sovereign. And the process itself was fueled by what Anthony Angie has referred to as a dynamic of difference, one in which endless difference has been created by the colonizers between the colonizers and the colonized. And it is that difference, which is often highly racialized, which sort of fuels and perpetuates ongoing colonial relations. It ensures that colonization won't end of its own accord. And the other piece of it is that in terms of European colonization, it has almost always been accompanied by what Angie calls the civilizing mission, the notion that colonization is doing something good in the world by civilizing and uplifting those who are colonized. The final piece I'd like to add about that is one that Stokely Carmichael, later known as Kwame Ture, talked about. And he said that colonization is not just the economic raping of someone, but the destroying of their culture, language, history, identification, and total humanity. And this is really key, the fact that in order to perpetuate colonization, who a people were be suppressed and erased. And that's why Jean-Paul Sartre, for example, recognized and articulated that colonization is inherently genocidal because you are erasing peoples as peoples in the process.
I actually want you to go a little bit deeper. So how does that apply to North America?
Okay, so what we have here is settler colonialism, which is basically a subset of colonization. What we think of as sort of classic colonialism, also sometimes referred to as external colonialism, is where the colonizers leave what we sometimes call the metropolis or the colonial center, the quote motherland, and go out to the colonies in order to exploit their land, labor, and resources, make a profit, send that profit back to the colonial homeland, and then eventually go home themselves. So, that's sort of the plan. Whereas with settler colonialism, that hierarchical relationship between the center and the periphery is changed so that the colonizers themselves sort of reject the power of the colonial center where they came from, right? Like the Anglo-Americans rejecting the British crown, and directly assert control over the lands and peoples at issue. What that means is that they came to stay. That's what makes them settlers. And that has a lot of implications that are somewhat different to other forms of colonization. What that means is that land was the most important thing because they can't stay unless they have land to stay on. And that means that they had to, in their minds, right, in order to be successful, they couldn't share the land. They had to take over the land and they had to eliminate whoever was there. They brought with them this presumed sovereign prerogative to establish a new state that was entirely under their own control, not to share the land with whoever was already there, but to establish their own state, to totally control it, which meant not only getting rid of the people who were already there, either literally, physically, or conceptually, but also controlling who would be allowed to remain in the state, who was not allowed to come into the state, and who had to come into the state. And so, that control over the population, the land, the population, and then what everybody inside those borders was doing is something that they claimed. And so that's sort of the foundation of settler colonial states like the United States or Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and what we still have today. And so one of the really important things about this is that colonialism here is not a thing of the past. We are currently living in a settler colonial system. And something that I think is important in trying to understand this and apply it to what this means for us today is something Patrick Wolf, who was did a lot of great analysis of settler colonialism, said. He said the settler invasion was not an event, but a structure. Okay? And he said its most dominant feature is not exploitation, but replacement. Exploitation is also significant, of course, but it's the replacement and the fact that it creates structures that's so important, not just one thing that happened. It's ongoing.
Wow. So we hear this term structural racism frequently. And of course, it's a subtitle of your book. Sometimes even in the mainstream media. What does structural racism mean? And is it the same thing as systemic racism? I know I even hear NBA players refer to systemic racism. Even last week when there was the report, the equity and diversity report at Georgia State, President Becker used the term systemic racism. So what does structural racism mean? What is systemic racism? What all these terms mean and how they relate to settler colonialism?
Okay. All right. Well, the first thing to note, I think, is that neither systemic nor structural racism means simply that there's a lot of it or that it's pervasive. I see it used in that way often, where people are only saying, there's racism everywhere we see. And they think that that means it's systemic. But I think the terms are, when thoughtfully, sort of consciously used, mean something quite different. Racism in this society is often presumed to be a matter of individual prejudice or animus, but we've come to realize several things. One is that at an individual level, we all have unconscious biases. And so, conscious prejudice or animus is not necessarily part of the perpetuation of racism or racial disparities in society. We've also come to see that policies or practices within any given social or legal or political institution can perpetuate racial or ethnic or gender disparities. So that's what I think of as systemic racism. Sometimes people use systemic and structural interchangeably. I think it's helpful to think of systemic racism as the racism within a particular system or institution that perpetuates these disparities, sometimes consciously, but not at all necessarily consciously. Thus, for example, you could be relying on a standardized test that is inherently biased in order to admit people into your educational institution. And nobody who's doing the admissions is thinking in a racist way, the way we would normally think of that term, right? But nonetheless, reliance on that test as a mark of qualification ensures that the student body will have a certain complexion, as it were, and it perpetuates that dynamic. I think of structural racism as looking beyond both individuals and single institutions to interinstitutional relationships, right? So structural racism to me acknowledges the multiple and overlapping causes of racism and the cumulative impact of racialized privilege and subordination. So, for example, you could be analyzing the way in which there's discrimination in terms of employment and a lot of racial disparities in employment. And then you could show how that connects up to levels of poverty and income disparities. And then that is tied to housing differentials and disparities. And then the housing is tied to schools. And then the people who don't have jobs, who can't get good housing, have to send their kids to schools where the expectation is not that the kids will go to college, but that they will go to prison. And then, of course, those kids aren't getting the good jobs. And so you see these patterns of interaction. And to me, that's what the benefit of assessing structural racism is. You start to see those interactions.
What you said reminds me of Malcolm X talked about this vicious cycle. You live in a poor neighborhood, therefore you get a poor education, therefore you get a poor job, and the cycle continues for your family, on and on. As I was thinking, and probably one of the motivators for this series, and a lot of things we've been discussing recently, has been this relationship with the police and communities of color, particularly African-American community, but also indigenous communities, Spanish-speaking communities. How does that relate to this whole concept of structural racism?
Well, I think you have to look at the functions of racism. And if part of the function is to ensure the control that I was talking about earlier, then the police serve as the front lines of that control. And it doesn't matter what color the police officers are, right? It's the function that they're serving that is perpetuating the racism and the disparities within the system.
And so that's why I guess when some say it's not just about a few bad apples or a few bad cops, but it's a question of a system and how Black people are policed and how other people of color are policed in this country. You talked about somewhat how this is relevant today. And one of the things I take note of is that you've written this book. We have another colleague in women's gender and sexuality studies, Tiffany King, who's written a book related to settler colonialism. And I'm beginning to hear the term more in academia. But the term colonialism, I remember when I was in college, as you mentioned, we're getting a little bit older. But when I was in college and I was first entering into activism, I would hear the term that we were colonized and colonialism, and by political economists and sociologists, historians. I would even hear of course, people in the movement like the Black Panther Party, AIM, and other folks were using that terminology. And one other recent occurrence, I think the historian Gerald Horne said that he felt that Black historians should need to apologize to the Black community for not defining our relationship to the United States as settler colonialism. So it's reappeared again. What do you how do you account for that? Why it's reappearing today in academia and in our discourses in academia?
That was actually one of the things I spent a lot of time thinking about when I first started working on this book. And I know we had some conversations about that many years ago, because I remembered that we used to talk about the situation of people of color in this country as being colonized. And we used to think of our movements in terms of national liberation movements. And I kept thinking about why did we stop talking about internal colonization here? And I didn't know if it was because the theory was inadequate. Like, was this just an analogy? Like, we're oppressed and colonized people are oppressed, so there seems like there's a lot of parallels? Or was it because the analysis was actually accurate, but it had been politically repressed? And there certainly was political repression of the movements that used this kind of framework. And I think that spilled over into academia. It made people who were academics or, had the access and the privilege to be writing books, hesitant to do that because it was seen as too radical. But I also came to believe, as I looked into it more closely, that part of the reason we stopped using it was that when we were thinking about colonialism back in the day, as it were, right, we were looking at external colonialism. We are saying there are similarities here to what is being experienced in the United States by these various groups to what has been experienced by people in Africa and Asia who have been colonized by European powers. But the problem was there were some real structural differences there. And the difference, to sort of overgeneralize, was that they could have liberation movements and national independence movements that basically got the colonial powers physically out of their territories. Now, there's a lot of other issues having to do with neocolonialism, et cetera, such that, one can't necessarily say they were truly decolonized. But nonetheless, that's different to when you're in a state where the colonizers came to stay, and they have stayed, and they're here. And so that was a lot of why I wanted to write this book, was because I decided that it does make sense to think of our situation in terms of colonialism. It's just a different kind of colonialism. And that's why settler colonization is so important, I think. And, I hate coming up with words that people don't understand. I hate academics who do that, and I hate to be one of them. But nonetheless, I feel like this is really an important framework for understanding racism in the US today. And just to summarize real briefly, and I can, give some examples if you want, but if you think about it that way, you come up with a very different understanding of race and how and why racism works and what can be done to start dismantling it. If you start from the perspective that we are normally given in the sort of dominant narrative in the US, it's that, there used to be problems, but now those problems have structurally been fixed, right? We have the Constitution's guarantee of equal protection, and we have laws to prevent discrimination. And so it's just a matter of implementing those better. The playing field is now level, is the story we're given. What a settler colonial analysis says is, let's look at what the motivating factors of racism have been and whether they still exist. And if you look at that, you look at the need for the land and the need for the settlers to eliminate indigenous peoples. And what that means is that in the course of doing that, right, they were racializing indigenous peoples because that's how they could justify it. If you look at their perceived need for labor, cheap labor, free, preferably labor, right? That was their motivation for developing or taking advantage of chattel slavery. But they couldn't just say we're evil people and we're going to take advantage of these other human beings. They had to come up with a rationalization for themselves as to why it was okay. And that rationalization was to racialize people who were being enslaved and to attribute, by racialization, I mean, first of all, creating certain categories of people and assigning them a race, right? And then attributing certain characteristics to that so-called race, right? That would enable their treatment. So they might, indigenous people might be racialized as wild and savage and untrustworthy and warlike and wandering hordes so that they didn't really have any land anyway to start with, et cetera, right? People of African descent might be racialized also as savage, but also primitive and uncivilized and, not smart and more like beasts of burden rather than attacking animals, right? And people that they wanted to racialize in order to attract for their labor, but then get rid of, right? Like Asians and Latinx folks, and especially Mexicans, there was different characterizations that they were racialized as that made it easy to say, okay, they're good workers, but we have a good excuse to kick them out when we don't want them. So it's those functions that were being served by people of color in settler society that I think are directly related to the ways in which we have been racialized. And those perceptions have persisted despite the changes in American society over the past 100 years or so. And the perceived need for those functions has persisted, right? This country is still on occupied indigenous land. And if, the powers that be don't want to face up to and deal with that fact, they need to maintain the justifications for being on this land, which are ultimately embedded in highly racialized stereotypes. If they want to persist in exploiting the labor of Black people or, allow for a system that incarcerates such incredible numbers of people of African descent, as well as other people of color, but particularly people of African descent and American Indians, right? If they want to be able to keep doing that, they have to rely on those racialized, imagery and stereotypes and things that have almost become common sense. They've been repeated so much in our history and in our narratives. And so to me, if you see that those racialized depictions of people aren't just a matter of personal prejudice, they're serving very important ongoing functions in this society, then that tells us that until we address those functions, those structures, we're not going to get rid of racism. It's not just a matter of, having, sensitivity training and groups and getting to know each other and feeling, touchy-feely and warm and fuzzy about each other.
Wow. That's something. No, I just had a conversation with a company today that wants to do some of these sessions. So I just thinking about that. Now, In your book, you use.
I'm not saying that we shouldn't also have interactions where we get to know each other as human beings.
I know that. I was just thinking about it because it was just a couple of hours ago, so it was fresh on my mind. But no, I hear you 100%, 100%, maybe more than 100%. In the book, you use this term racial realism. What is it? What is racial realism, and why is it important to understanding racism and injustice in the United States?
So that's a concept that Derek Bell, who is one of my great heroes, introduced in the 1990s. And any of y'all who are looking for good material on understanding race and racism in the United States, I really recommend Derek's work. But he said that our best efforts to combat racism have only and will only produce, quote, short-lived victories that slide into irrelevance as racial patterns adapt in ways that maintain white dominance. In other words, he said, we keep trying and trying and trying, and we have short-lived victories, but we see the same pattern emerging, which results in the same hierarchies of power and privilege. And he said that only if we acknowledge this reality, and that's what he called racial realism, was the acknowledgement of this reality, will we be able to bring about meaningful structural change and possibly even liberation. A lot of people kind of rejected that as, oh, that's just too depressing to think about, right? But I really appreciate that perspective because I think, as Professor Bell did, that unless we acknowledge the realities, we won't be able to make any meaningful change. I really think that it's denial of these realities that has kept us in these loops for so many decades. And so, that means we start by looking around and acknowledging the realities, right? To go back to a point you made a little while ago, right? About 1 in 1,000 Black men will be killed by the police. And in some age ranges, the rate for American Indian men is higher than the rate for African American men. And this is about 2.5 times the rate of white men, right? And a lot of the disparities that are at issue, right? We could go through them. I think most of our audience is probably fairly familiar, right? That with the fact that we have incredible disparities in wealth and income and housing and access to education and healthcare, et cetera, et cetera. But what we often don't confront is the fact that things are not really getting better in those terms. Some things are getting better, and we have more people of color in some positions, and there have been some changes, but statistically speaking, those disparities have not significantly improved, right? The unemployment rate for African American folks was in 2017 was almost a full percentage point higher than it was in 1968. In 2015, the Black home ownership rate was just about 40% compared to a white home ownership rate of 70%. And that was the same pretty much as it had been in 1968. The percentage of African Americans in prison or jail almost tripled between 1968 and 2016, and is currently 6 times that of white folks. Poverty rates have fallen somewhat, but still, we have more than 25% of all American Indians living officially in poverty. And on some reservations, it's well over 50%. We have lots of American Indian folks who still don't have running water or electricity in their homes. As we've seen, and that's part of why they've had such incredibly high COVID rates on the Navajo reservation, for example, or in San Carlos. So we still have these incredible disparities, and that's where we have to start. Like, we can't just pretend like, oh, somehow they're slowly getting better and they're going to go away of their own accord, because they're not.
Now, you reach the conclusion in your book that the 14th Amendment guarantee of equal protection is not enough. And I know that's been a basis of a lot of the civil rights movement, right? That we needed equal protection under the law based on the 14th Amendment of the United States Constitution. So how did you come to that conclusion?
Well, a lot of it has to do with what I was just talking about. The fact that, for well over 50 years, we thought we had equal protection guaranteed, and it's not changing the fundamental dynamics. I'm not saying that equal protection is not important. We have to struggle for and maintain the fight for equal protection under the law, for voting rights, all of those things that we've struggled for over many, many centuries now, and that were in many respects very significant gains of the civil rights movement. Those are important, but they're not going to solve the fundamental problems. They're only going to keep us, they're going to help us survive in order to be in a position to actually achieve some kind of liberation and self-determination. Equal protection, right? We have the 14th Amendment in 1868 that guaranteed us equal protection of the laws as well as due process, right? But still we had the Supreme Court coming in and striking down a lot of the laws that were passed during the Reconstruction era, and Plessy versus Ferguson saying separate but equal was perfectly fine, et cetera, et cetera. We had legalized apartheid and the Supreme Court saying that that was okay under the Constitution. Then we eventually, right, with Brown versus Board of Education, got that overturned so that we, legalized segregation was no longer okay. But we know, in fact, that de facto segregation is still pervasive in this society. We had the Civil Rights Act, we had the Voting Rights Act, right? But nonetheless, all of these things have been consistently rolled back in one way or another, and we still see them being rolled back, right? Every day we see some issue with voting rights or disenfranchisement of various forms or lack of equal protection. And so, the problem, I think, is that equal protection assumes that we have a level playing field. And then it says, okay, now that the playing field is level, we just have to make sure the law doesn't discriminate against anybody, which might be fine if we had a level playing field, but we don't. When you have structural racism and then equal protection, sort of a colorblind equal protection laid on top of structural racism, what you get is perpetuation of the disparities. And, that's why it hasn't been working. Now, when you start to think structurally about why it's not working, then you also have to ask yourself, I think, is equality our end goal? We certainly want equality, but is that our end goal, right? And as I think about it, I don't especially want to be equal within a colonial structure. I mean, what does that even mean, right? Do I want to be equally a colonizer? Do I want my fair share of what's been stolen from other people? That just, that's not my goal. And I think for a lot of us, it's not. So, we certainly want to and need to insist upon being treated equally, but that's different from saying we get to have a say in our own destinies. We should have a say in determining what kind of society this is, what kind of political structures we want, what kind of economic relationships we want, all of those sorts of things, right? Not presuming that the settler colonial framework that we've been given is inevitable and we have to just operate within those parameters.
I need to get that phrase and put it into a meme, put it on social media. That was so powerful. I want to ask one more question, and then I've been getting questions sent to me. People even texting me questions. So, taking a liberty with the fact that they know me to try to get ahead of other folk. But let me ask one more question.
And we want the softball.
Well, this question, Donald Trump, some people say you shouldn't say his name, but the 45 or whatever you want me to call him, he described the critical race theory movement as a cult disseminating un-American propaganda. He issued an executive order to prevent recipients of federal grants from, quote, inculcating divisive concepts about race or gender. Could you comment on this? First, tell the audience, because maybe a few people don't know what critical race theory is.
Okay. Critical race theory is an approach that fundamentally, or at its core, asks, what does race have to do with this? So it's not a cult. And there are no defined answers to that question, but it says the question of race is important. And whatever we're looking at, we need to also look at the racial dimension. Is there a racial dimension to this? And to look at that. And by applying that framework, critical race theory has come up with a set of basic principles that include things like unconscious bias is real, and racism has to be understood as a structural phenomenon, and a number of other sort of basic premises that sort of align with some of the things I've been saying tonight. What is significant, I think, about this executive order, and I think it's a very, very problematic and really dangerous move, is that it's trying to dictate to us the narrative about our own realities. It's telling us we are not allowed to think critically about what's going on around us. We are to accept a certain standard narrative about American society, what over the years many of us have called the master narrative or the dominant narrative, right? That America is the land of freedom and opportunity, that it's a nation of immigrants, that people have equal opportunity here, that it's a matter of individual striving that dictates outcomes, that this should be a colorblind society, and that everything, there's no collective responsibility for what has happened as a result of racialization and racial domination and subordination in this country. This executive order is an attempt to eliminate discussion. It specifically talks about unconscious bias, and training sessions on unconscious bias as being problematic. It specifically says that individuals should not be held accountable for essentially, things that they personally did not do, which is, trying to take the ground out from under reparations movements. It is saying that we have to accept that standard narrative. And to me, that says what we're doing when we think critically, when we come up with different perspectives, is very important, right? Apparently that's seen as a threat to the status quo. And, if you're trying to change the status quo, then which is perceived to be a threat is, might tell you you're on the right track.
I have one question that came from the chat. Said, I just started reading your book. I find it hopeful that you promise to help the reader envision liberatory options. Can you give a specific example of how the concept of decolonization can help us imagine a more racially just future?
That's a good one. And I'd like to start out with the caveat that I don't have any magical answers to this problem. This is a really big problem. and I have no magic wand. I do believe, however, that the answer lies in the notion of the right to self-determination, the fact that all peoples have an internationally recognized right to self-determination. And that can mean a lot of different things. Some people think it means creating your own state, but it doesn't need to do that, right? It doesn't need to be seen in a statist framework at all. It can be it can be implemented at a local level, and I believe has to be implemented at a local level before anything else. And so to me, liberatory options are grassroots initiatives that have begun small and that might not look, revolutionary, right? It might be getting that stop sign at that corner. If that brings people together and empowers them, to me, anything that people do that is empowering is a positive and liberatory thing. So you might be struggling to get a law changed, and that law itself is not going to liberate us, but the struggle might be liberatory. I love I can't quote you exactly, but to go back to Stokely Carmichael again, he's got a great little story about why he went to jail so many times for struggling for voting rights in the South. He said, I don't even believe in voting. I don't want to vote, right? But he kept getting arrested to ensure people's right to vote because he said, they are telling us, no, you are not allowed to do this. And therefore, to say, I am standing up against your attempt to confine me, to constrain me, to stop my rights, right? That's a liberatory movement. So there's all sorts of things, I think, and you know this much better than I do, but I think what's been happening in Jackson, Mississippi is a great example with the People's Power Assemblies. And that's a multiracial phenomenon, right? In Jackson, they've come together where to have people come together and talk about their priorities for the city and to figure out how budget money should be spent. What are their priorities for this, use of taxpayer dollars? And they have assemblies where people come together and discuss it. And these are multicultural assemblies. It's everybody who has an interest in living in Jackson is being invited and encouraged to participate, and their priorities are being formed in those assemblies. And to me, that's a great and wonderful and uplifting example because everybody is being empowered towards a common goal that furthers their communities.
And I think you mentioned earlier this concept of self-determination. And just this weekend, I read an article that was in the Journal of Negro Education, 1968, that talked about the need to continue to struggle for reform within the system, but at the same time to create these independent institutions that would be the basis of self-determination. So, like you said, some people do have the desire to form a state or whatever, but on a basic level right now, just to be able to form institutions and relationships with like-minded folk to begin to determine some things in our own communities, whether it's our education or how we're going to eat food, whatever. These efforts are important. We see them today. Someone else asked this question. If I could get my phone to work with me right now. Someone asked the question, are you saying that racism is a means, through subordination and oppression, to an end to perpetuation of colonialism, the continuance of colonialism? Is that your argument?
Essentially, yes. I think in some cases, racism may be an end in itself, but that's more at a sort of individual or psychological level. I think that at a social structural level, racism is the means to an end, and that end is the maintenance of the status quo as we have it now, which involves continuing to justify the occupation of the land and the exploitation of labor and control over all aspects of society. And I think that racism is used to facilitate those. I also think racism is used essentially to divide and conquer people so that there won't be sort of collective or to undermine collective efforts to bring about social change. Just historically, if you look at all sorts of movements like the union movement, say, right, racism was very effectively used to divide and undermine the union movement. So I do think it is consistently used to perpetuate the status quo. And
now, I mentioned earlier, I'm sorry, go ahead, I'm sorry.
It's okay. I was just going to say that's part of why I think it's so important for us to take racism seriously, all of us, against all peoples. And what that analysis tells me is that, I won't be able to fix racism against Japanese Americans in my case, right? My family was interned during World War II, et cetera, et cetera. So, we have our own history of issues, but the analysis tells me that I can't just focus on racism against Asian Americans, because that racism is integrally tied into and rooted in racism against people of African descent and racism against all people of color on this continent who were not originally indigenous to this continent, is founded on the continued racism and its concrete consequences, right? The appropriation of indigenous land, the occupation, the justification of the occupation, the stealing of indigenous folks' resources and lands, and their oppression. All of our racisms are rooted in that. And so that's why it's so important to take indigenous rights seriously, and why it's so important to take the racism against other people of color seriously, or if you're white, against everybody seriously, right? Because I don't think that this current system benefits anybody except a very, very small percentage of people. And even them, I don't think it really benefits because, among other things, it's destroying the planet. But that's a whole nother story.
Well, I have another question, and I think you're uniquely qualified to answer this, given the work you've done against political repression. Someone asked, do you believe a new COINTELPRO actively works in destabilizing groups today? And I'm always, they say a new COINTELPRO. Can you explain what the old COINTELPRO was? For anybody in the audience who might not know what COINTELPRO is or was.
So COINTELPRO is an acronym for Counterintelligence Programs. And those were programs, that was the label given to programs that were run by the FBI starting in the 1950s against groups that were perceived to be communist or socialist, against virtually all Black organizations in the United States, against other movements of people of color, against the anti-war movement, the women's liberation movement, basically anybody who was seen as a threat to the status quo. However, it took its most virulent forms of repression against the American Indian movement, the Puerto Rican independence movement, the Black Panther Party, the groups that were really fostering self-determination. It involved a variety of tactics, from spying on people, surveillance, infiltration, up to trying to disrupt organizations by putting false propaganda in the media, by creating false information between groups, by, bad jacketing people, as they called it, to make it look like they were the snitches or the informants so that the groups would tear each other apart, and having groups, attack each other, all the way up to wrongfully convicting people, setting them up with, fabricated evidence, guidance, and when all that failed, straight up assassinations such as Fred Hampton and Mark Clark, for example. So, this was just the FBI's programs, right? There were at least a dozen other federal agencies that were found to have similar types of programs, all of which is recorded, or a lot of which is recorded, not all by any means, in the Senate, a Senate subcommittee on intelligence's report that was compiled after several years of investigation. So this isn't just, the weirdo conspiracy theorists here. It's the Senate confirming that this was happening. So the question is there a new one now? I don't think it's a new one. I think that they've always continued with some variation of these programs, even though they stopped calling them COINTELPROs. So yes, I do think it's still happening. But I do think it's adapted to the times, but it's definitely happening. We still see many, many instances of surveillance, of infiltration, of setting people up, of a lot of use of agent provocateurs, right? You see in the movement for ecological justice, in the movement at Standing Rock, in Black Lives Matter, in whatever movement is seen as having a lot of momentum these days, these tactics continue. And what I think that tells us is that we have to be smart, right? We have to pay attention. We have to know that these things are happening, but we also can't be intimidated by them, right? You pay attention. You use your common sense. If what somebody is saying does not make sense, don't do it, right? But at the same time, you keep doing what does make sense. And, we just have to keep struggling, because one of the things I think we learned from all of these struggles is that resistance is never futile, right? To the extent we don't resist, then, the means of oppression are amplified, and we get more and more problematic measures being imposed on us. And to the extent we do resist, we hold those back, even if we can't completely reverse the direction in which they're going.
And for those who want information on COINTELPRO, actually, Dr. Saito's husband, Ward Churchill, wrote one of the best books called Agents of Repression on COINTELPRO, really focusing on the American Indian movement and the Black Panther Party and governmental repression against them. And a good resource is the documentary COINTELPRO 101, which is available from Freedom Archives. I guess we're winding down. I think we're about at an hour, unless the host send me something in the chat to tell me they want me to continue. Another question is, your example of structural racism and college admissions exemplifies the link between colonialism and epistemology. How do you see the history of this legacy playing out in the 21st century Western Academy? This is certainly an academic using terms like epistemology.
In 1 minute, let me just say briefly that colonialism, as we know it, there have been other forms of it in other eras, but as we know it, it is very much rooted in a Western civilization worldview. And that involves an entire epistemology, right? That involves everything about how the world is understood and structured. And all I can say is that we need to look at that clearly, to look at the premises upon which the Western worldview is founded, such as there's always progress, there's a hierarchy between the divine and the human and nature, right? People are above nature, people are supposed to take advantage of nature, that's where progress comes from, science and technology are gonna save us, et cetera, right? And just to realize that there are other ways of understanding the world. There are many, many, many different worldviews, many different epistemologies, many different, paradigms for understanding everything that we see around us. And we need to open our minds up to appreciate them and to think about how they might lead us to a better way of organizing ourselves and not killing the planet.
Dr. Saito, they're telling me it's time to wrap. I really appreciate not only you being here tonight, but again, you sharing with us, writing, putting your labor, your love, your time into writing this book, Settler Colonialism, Race, and the Law. And I would encourage folk to pick it up. I'm not getting a cut, I'm not getting paid for this, so don't think I'm just saying it because I'm getting some money. Okay, but it's a great book. I think it begins an important conversation, and we need to continue this conversation and figure out how it applies to us developing policy. What does it mean to develop a policy of self-determination and decolonization? What does it mean? How does it play into reparations even? How does it play in terms of what we want? Did you want to say a couple of words, Dr. Saito, in closing?
I just wanted to say thank you for this opportunity. And that's really what I wanted to do with this book. I don't feel like I have any answers. I just want us to start the conversation looking at things through some different lenses.
Again, we want to thank the Center for the Study of Africa and its Diaspora. We want to thank the Georgia State University Library, which we're very proud of the work that our library is doing. We want to also thank the Decatur Book Festival. In mentioning Decatur, I want to share my screen, and this event that Dr. Saito mentioned earlier, Indigenous Peoples Day, which is next Sunday. Of course, many people see the Indigenous Peoples Day as what was called Columbus Day. And of course, Columbus Day is recognizing the legacy of the colonization of the Western Hemisphere. And so the Beacon Hill Black Alliance for Human Rights, this is an organization that led the fight to get rid of the Confederate monument in the city of Decatur, which was in front of the DeKalb County Courthouse. But this Sunday at 6 p.m., October 11th, are having a family-friendly, I should say, event held on the Decatur Square near the cannon. And as the cannon was there to represent the taking of this land through force for the indigenous people of this area. So there'll be spoken word, socially distanced, so please wear your mask. You could contact me at aadaku@gsu.edu, and I could share you this information. Beacon Hills Black Alliance for Human Rights. If not, just look up Beacon Hill Black Alliance for Human Rights, and it'll be on their website. But take care. Thanks again to the library. Thanks again to, or the GSU library, I should say. Thanks again to the Center for the Study of Africa and its Diaspora. And thanks again to the Decatur Book Festival. And most of all, thanks to Dr. Saito for writing this brilliant book and sharing her knowledge with us this evening. Take care and free the land.
And thank you to the audience.
Yeah, thank you for listening. And
yes.
Take this to the barbershop, the beauty shop, your chat rooms, social media, wherever you engage with folk. Let's continue this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you all.